Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming out.
Yeah.
As you may know, this originally was supposed to be the rollout of the executive order with Ann Neuberger, and I got a note from Ann saying can't do it. Executive orders apparently made it through the lawyers, so it may appear before Christmas, but the rollout will be at the White House, not here. Sorry. And then so I said, well, Ann, why don't you just come and talk? And she said, no, I can't do that either. And then I thought, if I was going to listen to people talk about what the administration got right or didn't get right, I would pick these three people. One, because they're experts, and two, because they're friends, and that makes it a lot easier. The format will be, I gave them one or two questions. God knows what they're going to say. And then we'll have some time at the end, I hope, for questions and answers. But with that, let me start with my friend. Let's introduce ourselves. Go ahead.
Mark Montgomery, I'm at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.
Kiersten Todt, I'm president of Wondros.
Rob Knake, I'm an independent consultant.
And Jim Lewis, I'm almost an independent consultant. So with that, let's begin. I told them I'd ask them three questions. Very general. First one, what did the administration get right? So Mark, why don't we start with you? And if I could ask you to limit your responses, I know you could go on.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
5 minutes max.
Well, on this one? So first I want to say...
What?
First I want to say, it's going to be really interesting. The Biden administration came in on the heels of a major, cybersecurity fault and SolarWinds, and was given, I think it gave it a good, I don't want to say artificial, but a highlighted sense of cybersecurity. I think we're going to find that eventually Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon integrated together are going to cause the incoming Trump administration to have the same kind of cybersecurity thing. So they came in on that. I think, having been there at the kind of 1998 creation with Roger Cressy, who's here, and Dick Clark and others, 23 years later, no administration focused more on cybersecurity than the Biden administration, and getting it and highlighting it and making it an important issue. So first I want to acknowledge that. And I think they did do some great things happened on their watch, and I think largely because of them. CISA grew in its budgetary authority from about 1.6 or 1.7 billion at the start of the administration to about 2.9 billion today. And as John Katko used to say, the Republican representative, it's a $5 billion mission. So they got them another 25% of the way there. There's still work to be done. I think there's also other interesting wins. Like I think the establishment of the Cybersecurity Review Board will be seen, as a positive thing over time. The fact that it's not in legislation yet is a negative, but it can get there. I think the small things like the internet, the labeling, their labeling initiative to have, the labeling of software products as having a cybersecurity. I don't think all the details are there. I think the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, still has work to do. But there's wins like that along the way. And I would say, they have 20 or 30 small wins that go with one big budgetary win, and the overall focus of national security, treating cybersecurity like it's a legitimate issue. So I think that's a lot, but I think they also left a lot on the table, and I'm sure that's questioned too.
It's actually not, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Kiersten.
So building off it, it's great to be here with you, Jim, in your time, and Rob and Mark, because we've had a lot of conversations, obviously, about this over the years. I think that, to your point, this administration really prioritized cybersecurity in a very thoughtful way. I think there were a lot of reasons for that, both resources as well as threat, and the idea of being able to truly identify cybersecurity as a national security issue and putting those resources behind it. I know we'll talk about ONCD in the White House, but I think, sitting where I sat as chief of staff at CISA, the resources being able to take that role, I think Jen Easterly, as well as the team, really getting out into industry and building trust was a real thoughtful progression as far as how you look at operational collaboration. I think taking public-private partnerships, a term that really lost its meaning many years ago, into how do you share intelligence to respond to real-time threats, particularly in response to Ukraine. I think that was really demonstrated what it could be when you're sharing that type of work at the operational level with industry. companies stepping in to say, we know we can't do this by ourselves. I think the government, this administration, appreciated that it wasn't meant to be the author of a lot of cyber and cyber issues, cyber technology, but really working to convene was an evolution. Software bill of materials, I think, is important. I'd also say that, secure by design is directionally correct. We've got to get to a place where the federal government can actually impose penalties on companies that are building defective software. That's going to take a little bit of time. And I think, the CSRB, the ability to review, it's this assessment of where does government really have its strengths. I think when it comes to critical infrastructure, it's in convening, it's in sharing intelligence across sectors. We've always worked well sector by sector. What we saw, I think, in the last 4 years was more of a motion and momentum around cross-sector work to truly appreciate and share intelligence for that purpose. And I think, it's what we build off of, and the success of the Biden administration will in some part be also how it transitions into this next administration. I think one of the things that Obama to Trump did was you saw individuals seeing cyber not as a political issue and taking the time to invest in that transition. And hopefully as we look at the evolution, because I think Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, the Typhoon portfolio is going to be the most significant priority in a cyber perspective moving into the next administration.
So I think the biggest thing that we did in the administration was really to shift the Overton window on cyber regulation, right? This was the first administration that has put out a national strategy saying regulation is going to be a tool in the toolkit for cybersecurity. I think that was significant, but even more significant than that was the response, right? We didn't get the kind of outcry we've had in the past from Republicans in Congress saying, you're going to regulate over our dead body, right? In fact, we, I think, saw a shift towards we will work with you to do smart, thoughtful regulation in areas where you do not have authority, and we're seeing that play out even to this day and into the next administration. I think that there's some decent hope we will see Republican sponsorship of a bill on AI cybersecurity in the next administration. I think it's possible we will see water security. We will see a continual focus on trying to fill gaps rather than a focus on just rolling back all regulation on cyber. We've talked about Salt Typhoon a couple times already. When the FCC came out and said, we're going to use our regulatory authority, the response to that was not, you can't do that, Chevron doctrine, we will fight this no matter what. It really seemed to be, yeah, how do we not have regulation over this absolutely fundamental, critical piece of our critical infrastructure? And so I think that kind of shift, more than even any individual new regulation that was issued by any one administration agency, is probably the most important thing.
Hey, Jim, can I just jump in one? Because
No.
I didn't use a three-letter word. There's a three-letter agency that I think we should call out, and it's TSA, Transportation Security Agency, not because they heavily grope me every time I go to the airport, but because I honestly think Dave Pekoski has done the singular best job of any sector risk management agency lead, any cabinet member at moving the ball on exactly this issue. And while I acknowledge the movement of the window a little bit, I would say I would give a lot of the credit. It's inside TSA. The two infrastructures where I think we have actually moved the ball on at a regulatory or rulemaking level are rail and pipeline, which both belong to him. Or to his agency. And I note this mostly because he was a Trump appointee. He's in a weird 5-year thing, reappointed by President Biden. The smartest thing the Trump administration coming in can do is keep Dave Pekoski at TSA for the remaining 3 years of his tour. To get rid of him would, I think, actually hurt the cybersecurity and the security of our critical infrastructure in some very important areas of the United States. He's that good an individual leader on this.
I'll offer to build off of that because I think it's a really important point that the other element to his success was how well he worked across other entities and from a sector perspective, because going to that cross-sector approach again, this all has to be done in a joint way. And when we look at where the challenges are, it has to be being able to bring them together. I do want to follow up on something Rob said about regulation, which is incident reporting. I think putting incident reporting on the map, there's obviously a debate right now with where SEC is versus where CSIS is, critical infrastructure reporting for cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure. But what we have seen is some motion on big companies' part when that impetus and the catalyst to actually report has helped to address certain issues. We've got a little ways to go, but I think putting that on the map, being able to have that opportunity for comments and being able to evolve, because I think the regulation point is we've all got to raise the baseline.
Maybe we can build on Rob's remark, and we'll start with Rob. So the national strategy was precedential in many ways. That's precedential with a C. It really broke some barriers, I thought. What do you think will survive out of it? No, you're welcome. What do you think will survive out of it?
I've been worrying on this question a little too much. If you look at the history of strategies, the last Trump strategy did something very interesting on the regulation point. It didn't say anything. The Bush strategy had said, we're not going to regulate. So the fact that the Trump strategy didn't say anything at all, I took that as a win at the time. And then that actually allowed, in the first Trump administration, other agencies to put out their cyber strategies and say, we will use our regulatory authority within these parameters, right? Within narrowly targeted, smart, focused, all those words that you would expect. And that's what the Department of Homeland Security cyber strategy said. So my sort of low bar for hope is that the next Trump strategy will continue to be silent on regulation and then leave it to the individual regulatory agencies. I'm hoping a next step up from that is we will see a focus in their strategy on regulatory harmonization, something that everybody agrees that we need to do, something the National Cyber Director's Office has focused on quite extensively, something there is a bill to help speed along that has a small chance of still passing in this Congress. And that they will say, so we will harmonize regulation to make it smarter and reduce burden, and then we will add in regulation to fill in gaps as necessary. That would be my hope for what survives.
No, any
So,
comment?
my biggest frustration is probably, I'm okay with it, not surprisingly. I like the strategy. I like the strategy. I think it tried to name names. Obviously, anything that's put in the interagency process is diluted beyond any reasonable measure, unless you're in the middle of a crisis. The thing that frustrates me, and I'm hoping this administration tackles right away, is National Security Memorandum 22 was way too late to getting done, and didn't really tackle the hard issues we have in critical infrastructure management. And then I think it's PPD 41, which is now the old goat in the locker there at like 10 or 11 years old, on how we do incident response for cyber. The fact that it's a decade old is really unmanageable. Both of those, I'm hoping that the administration can establish its leadership team fast and tackle those issues. Because to me, the blocking and tackling of administration is to determine what your guidance should be and get it out early. And, I give the Biden administration a 1-year pass because NCD got inserted on them. But the second and third year is kind of on their mismanagement. And the previous Trump administration got their reasonable national security strategies and cyber strategies out 2 or 3 years in, which is really late. So I'm hoping this version of the Trump administration can deliver products in the first 6 months that allow agencies to make decisions, allow you to work with Congress to pass laws as necessary in a way that you can meaningfully appropriate and carry them out over a 4-year stretch. That's a hope and an aspiration, not a proven reality.
I think the critical infrastructure piece and the regulation piece is going to be, I think you will see an evolution from it. I think the strategy laid important groundwork, and I think importantly what it did is it also talked a lot more about the role of industry with government. So whether you look at putting the responsibility on industry for certain things, the regulation piece was much more about how do we do this together versus what are we imposing on a sector. And I think to Mark's point, what we have to look at now is what does it truly mean to be critical infrastructure? We've struggled with that. since Executive Order 13636, when it talked about, what it meant to be critical infrastructure. It felt more like a punishment than an opportunity. We've really got to move that ball in this, and I think you've set the strategy that I know you had a huge role in, and Mark, to some extent, really sets the groundwork for what that can be. But that has to be the focus now with industry to be able to raise the baseline, so we don't have the variability across all of it.
We can ask for more chairs since there's people in the back. So just hang on, they're coming. God knows from where. But this is the question I told them we were going to ask, and it's actually the reason we all started talking, and we've been talking about this for a while, which is, we currently have at least 3 heads doing cybersecurity. We have ONCD, we have the NSC, and we have CISA. And I think a minimal approach would be to at least chop off one of those heads. But what would we do to untangle this knot? No suggestions. What would you do to fix the... And ONCD, I'll tell you, you were there. It's got some real opportunities, but we'll see how it goes. And so far, we have a longer list of people who've turned down the job than have accepted it. But Mark?
Let me start only because I think I helped build this Gordian knot, and since I don't think Alexander the Great's going to emerge out of the ground and untie it, I think we're going to have to rely on Mike Waltz, and I think it's very doable. I think what you do is the National Security Council reverts to its historic norm, which is a senior director for cyber, on par with the senior director for resilience. That senior director runs really important things, like how we properly execute NSPM 13 and deter, and run operational offensive cyber to deter the adversary. If you ever listen to one of my old bosses, Senator Angus King, if there's one thing we're not doing, it's deterring anyone in cyberspace.
Hey, that's my line.
Yes, I know. And he said it in the middle of a Reagan Defense Forum panel yesterday that had nothing to do with anything about cyber. He suddenly just started talking about it for about 5 minutes. My point on this is, if you make that job about offensive cyber, working with State Department's CDP on international, and running incident reporting for now, because legally, or by guidance and by norms, that's their job right now. You could do that. I would then look at NCD. I think has the strategy part down and the budget part down. That was 2 of the 4 big tasks for them. The other 2 tasks they have to work out. They have a problem with CISA. They've got to figure out with CISA who manages critical infrastructure partnerships at the high level. And I think we've had 2 CISA directors who've done a fantastic job explaining CISA. Externally facing, whether it's with an orange pineapple or Rubik's Cube, or a pineapple pizza or a Rubik's Cube, I get it. CISA matters. Now CISA needs to probably focus, the leadership needs to focus internally, organize itself to be a warfighting, as Jen Easley calls it, the civilian cyber defense agency of the United States, which means doing proper troop to task, getting themselves right. If they do that and allow NCD to be the one that reaches across the interagency to make people cooperate with CISA products, to work with CISA at the right level. CISA can never force cabinet members to work with CISA. The White House can. And then the second one would be Is it
ONCD or NSC?
That's ONCD with negotiating that with CISA. And then the second negotiation is ONCD in the White House over time. The UCG put the preparation and readiness portion of cyber incident response. Let NCD run it. One of the successes of this administration, they got it up to about 90 people. It's now, because there's too many Schedule Cs in there and a type of Schedule A, they're going to slip down to about 45 at the transition, in my mind, maybe 47. But they can rapidly get back up to 90 people. They can manage that. I think the CRG, or the at that moment incident response, will stay with the NSC for some period of time. I think it'll take NCD demonstrating its value continually inside the White House for a White House to transfer that responsibility over. But the broad issues of incident response and management of the critical infrastructure, the critical infrastructure of the United States, those are 2 missions that a smart Trump administration will gradually push over to the NCD.
One metric you can use, it's a cheap metric, is here's the White House and here's Union Market. And where ONCD is located, the closer they get to Union Market, the less influential they are. But something to watch. They've already been moved once, I think, but Kiersten.
So I'll start, I think, with CISA. I think I take the point that the last two leaders have done a really important job externally facing. I think, I've heard very interesting assessments of, is it important to be externally facing? Is it important to be internally facing? There's a director and a deputy director. I think in a perfect world, you've got one doing one and one doing the other. You absolutely have to focus now on what is the internal management of the agency, given the evolving threat and what's going on. I don't think that mitigates the need to continue to be externally facing. I think the challenge is who is responsible for developing trust with industry. And I don't think you can draw this dark line that says one entity is and one entity isn't. CISA has to continue to be a trusted partner with industry. It doesn't have regulatory authority. It can't tell industry what to do, but it can certainly work with industry on efforts that I think are important. It is also the national risk manager, right? So if you're pushing that forward, then what does that mean? What is its responsibility across critical infrastructure sectors? I think the challenge right now is that CIS is the SRMA, the Sector Risk Management Agency, for 9 sectors. It's also managing all the sectors. What does that actually mean? How do you flesh that out? If you bring this then into ONCD and to the role as it stands, you obviously can't have 2 roles in cyber that are at par with one another. If we go back to what happened in 2021, that was never the intention, but it happened that way based on a few things and how the process worked. So ONCD should be externally facing, looking at industry. But I think the role in the White House, it's an interesting point about incident response. I think when you think about what Ann Neuberger did right in the transition with Solar Winds, with Colonial Pipeline, she was managing the response and she was the face of it, and it was a very clear line of authority. Then obviously other people came into positions and it was less clear who was doing that. That role, the White House role, should probably be, I think, a cyber advisor to the national security advisor. Looking at where does that knowledge hold. I would want to know all of the resources allocated to that office to truly be responsible for incident response, because how are you working across the sectors? So I think you've got to keep ONCD at a higher level. I think it does have to be able to work with the to work with industry. The White House has to work with the interagency, but there has to be a clear roadmap for who is doing what. And I don't think that we can say that these are in buckets, because all of them are going to have to work with industry. All of them are going to have that trust. The question is who gets the first point and who's the decision maker.
Let me jump back in. I just say no one's been a bigger arguer for the National Risk Management Agency responsibility for CISA than me, and no one's been more disappointed. NSM 22, called him like a coordinator, so a word that means almost nothing, and a word that interagency went good. That means they can't tell us crap, and they moved on. And that's the problem we have here. We have a series of federal agencies out there, and I'll name them. EPA, actually they're not the worst. I'll start with the worst. Agriculture, Department of Education, both suck. They don't care. They've never cared about cyber. They don't take their sector risk management seriously. They each spend $250,000 a year, which we all know is one full-time equivalent, to manage 8,000 farms and delivery systems, or 9,000 school districts. No one can tell them what to do. We have not empowered someone to say, this is a bull crap, it's got to stop, and you've got to act like a professional sector risk management agency. You have to follow the law. The law tells them this, and they don't do it. And the reason they don't do it is we don't have someone in charge of the White. You cannot do it from CISA, and the NSC is not big enough. The NSC holds a meeting, Secretary of Education says, things are fantastic, I'm going to do this, leaves the meeting. By the time he gets in his SUV in West Exec, he forgot what he said. And then when his budget comes out, it's $250,000 again, because he doesn't care about cybersecurity, never has. None of them have, and no Secretary of Agriculture has cared to a degree that matters. They won't care until someone from the White House puts a size 15 in their backside. And the only person going to do that is the White House, and the only person who's going to have a staff large enough is the NCD. So I think you empower that person to do that, and you get out of the way. Or you fire the NCD if they can't do it. But from my point of view, until an administration does that, we're not going to get this right. So I think the interagency really rides with the NCD. NSC doesn't have the time for it. The National Security Advisor doesn't want to talk to the Secretary of Education ever, right? But the National Cyber Director does. So I do want to give them that responsibility. CISA has a big role. Part of the role is listen to CISA. NCD going, listen to what they're saying, participate in the JCDC, do whatever they tell you. sorry I get pissed about this, but it's really, we're
One
about
thing I don't
25 years into this.
Rob is the only one who hasn't spoken.
30 seconds though, because I think what people forget is actually CIS's #1 mission is to protect the .gov. And that is actually not something that anybody ever remembers because it's not actually important. So to your point, but please.
Yes. I can't even remember who I'm disagreeing with here, but it's one of you. I think it's fundamentally important to shift incident response for cyber incidents to the NCD out of the NSC. I would move the cyber response group over. I would put that under the NCD and have that mechanism combined with the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, providing the backstop, the support, the intel for cyber incidents. If it's a cyber incident, if it stays in the cyber silo, it should be at the NCD. When things move to the NSC is when something begins in cyberspace and moves outside of it, because it is in fact a China issue and not a cyber issue. Or more importantly, you need to bring in non-cyber tools to respond. You're getting into diplomatic, economic, intelligence responses. So if the Chinese have done something that bad, arguably they have done that with Salt Typhoon, that becomes something that needs to get brought into the NSC process to look at all instruments of national power in response. And so I agree with Mark, I would have a senior director who's responsible for bringing that process in up to the deputies, up to principals. But the face of the White House on a cyber incident should be the National Cyber Director. It should not be somebody on the NSC. The day-to-day management of that crisis, I think, needs to happen at the NCD, which is staffed and has the authorities to do that, that are, I think, much clearer for NCD than they are for the NSC. So I would move in that direction. The fear that I have is that given Salt Typhoon, the instinct to say we can't eliminate any of these positions, we need to stay focused on cyber, is going to mean that we will continue to have two heads. We'll continue to have somebody at the deputy assistant to the president level, deputy national security advisor, because the incoming team won't want to demote a position in a time of crisis. Moreover, just like at the last transition, if you're beginning with a crisis, which I think Salt Typhoon is turning into, you can put somebody in that role, full-time, non-acting capacity on day one. NCD is a Senate-confirmed position. So we could end up, I think, in an unfortunate situation in which the Trump team says, we're going to keep both these roles and we will continue to have this power struggle.
I think one of the things to think through based on what you've just talked through, and I would agree that ONCD has to be the senior entity in the White House, but given what we're seeing with Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, likely just the beginning of others, does it make sense to actually put somebody in the White House focused on the China threat? Because I think if we are seeing this from a cyber perspective and we're really concerned about it, and we don't know where that information and how we're managing that, how do we prioritize this in a way that truly reflects the seriousness of the threat? Because what we haven't done well as the federal government is truly figure out how to help critical infrastructure defend itself. And so what are the resources and the tools the federal government can offer, which is intelligence, which is cross-sector intelligence, threat analysis, that it can share with the sector-specific entities that are doing that? Because I think your point is right. It doesn't, demotion of a role doesn't necessarily mean we're not focusing on it. It's so much more important to have a clear sense and clear lines of authority.
But what we've seen is, so I don't think this, for one thing, these are names made up by a company. The Chinese don't call themselves Flax Typhoon, for God's sake.
It's Taiwan.
I'm waiting on Corn Dog Typhoon, but
They're running out of potential, but it's not a surprise. The Chinese have had repeated successes for at least the last 15 years. So what do we do about it? I mean, admiring the problem is very important for think tanks, but what would you do in addition to that?
so.
Since you brought it up.
I tend to think, I come from a do tank, so we definitely are going to do a few things, a couple. I think the two strong recommendations I'll be pushing, one I have a lot, you've heard me talk about it, and I won't belabor it here, but I think we need to be able to generate more cyber forces on the offensive side. I think long-term that means we have to have an independent cyber service. We can have a separate hour on that later on. The second one is, how do we get ourselves better in the domestic thing? We've told companies, do not go buy some Pegasus or NSO software and start hacking back and reaching downstream. Don't we're not going to give any letters or mark. You're not allowed to go downstream and start a war for us. But alternatively, and as opposed to any other warfare area, if someone were being attacked by a Chinese cruise missile, we wouldn't say, well, you're kind of on your own. You might want to build your own air defense system here. Good luck. We would shoot it down. We would take action. But in cyber, we treat this like it's, well, you're on your own. And I think we need to begin, we wanted to do the hunt and incident response teams at CSIS. We gave a lot of money to that. I'll gently say it's gone to something else. And the hunt and incident response teams are nowhere near, 4 or 5 CPTs is what I would have, that's cyber protection team equivalents, which is where they should be right now after 4 years of funding. That's not going to happen. We can't have law enforcement do it. Americans don't want that. Can't have the intelligence community do it. Americans don't want that. So you're down to the people who are going to defend are either the cyber mission force, which is totally not strong enough to do what it needs to do with the adversary, or we're going to really have to organize the National Guard properly to do a mission, to get on our domestic networks and help defend us. Jim, this is coming. And I think we have to figure it out properly. We have to figure out the right authorities. We're going to have a named operation that says, look, we're going to have to get on these. There are ways to do this, but I don't see another solution for how we more aggressively defend ourselves against these Chinese attacks. It's persistent. Salt Typhoon's not 6 months old or 8 months old. It's 2 or 3 years old. Volt Typhoon is an actual warlike event, is operational preparation of the battlefield. If they were doing this with kinetic, if this was Russian Spetsnaz in the 1980s, putting satchels of weapons, which they did, around our critical infrastructure, we would be having a very strong conversation with the Chinese. Now, instead, it's like, well, okay, we're treating it like it's espionage. It's not. It's attacking it's preparing our critical infrastructure for a future attack and a crisis or casualty because we're so vulnerable. I think we really need to be much more aggressive about this, and we need to I think the National Guard, and look, I didn't start here. I started thinking the National Guard was a crazy idea, but I'm at the point where I'm not sure that there's any other element out there, tool out there, that we can use to protect our networks in cyberspace.
So that's one way to look at where we are in this. And this problem, as I say, is probably about 20 years old, which is the Chinese appear to have a comprehensive signals intelligence strategy directed against the United States. And we have a bunch of stuff. Mark saw me roll my eyes when he said National Guard. What would you do? I mean, we're not doing very well. What would you do?
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. So,
after you, Alphonse.
well, I do think this idea of a cyber reserve, right? I mean, it's very conceptual. We have to figure out how to flesh it out. But I'm going to take a little bit more of a tactical approach to what Mark said. I agree that we've got to be able to be much more aggressive offensive. I mean, I think everybody knows what we are dealing with is pre-positioning, which means that if there were any indication that China wanted to come after us, they could do it in a moment. I think what's also really concerning is that when you look at the threat intel assessment back in 23, it talked about sowing social chaos, creating discord. We as a nation have developed a reputation for being mentally not very strong. We are challenged by our cognitive durability and our ability to get into social chaos pretty easily. That's a separate and distinct issue, but I would argue that's critical infrastructure. Our ability to be more strong and to understand what is truth and what is not, I'm not making a misinformation plea here, but the fact that 2 of our greatest adversaries see our psychological durability as a tool that they can use against us is something we absolutely have to note and take care of and really figure out how we're going to manage that. But the second piece is, if we think about critical infrastructure and when something happens, it happens at a local and regional level, right? It happens on the ground. So CISA has regional offices that are based off of FEMA. Originally, they were really dealt with as something that wasn't dealt with. It just received sort of lots of lack of attention, to put it nicely. There have been more investment in the regional directors, in the cybersecurity advisors, the physical security advisors. CISA put election security advisors at those levels. I think when we think about a guard, which I would love to understand and flesh that out more, not that we talked about it back in 2016. There was a Pentagon official who was talking about how do we build out the cyber reserve. I think there's something there. but we should also simultaneously be investing in these regional offices, because when something happens, those are the people on the ground who are going to be there. Are they equipped? Are they resourced? Do they have the threat intelligence that headquarters has, that DHS has, that the White House has? How do we build out that capability in a much more direct and offensive way, and have regional offices not be about regional people, but about federal people advocating and protecting localities and critical infrastructure at the local level? Because that is where we're first going to see the impact, and the ability to mitigate it can happen there.
Can I just say, I support those regional offices. That won't answer the broader question we're asking about how you, that'll just be, I mean, in a
Response.
crisis,
It's the
then,
response.
yeah, then it should be, that's one more person in the room with us.
And just a footnote, 2 footnotes, and then we'll go to Rob. Footnote 1, the idea of giving DOD the lead on this is really unappealing.
Yeah.
Footnote 2, I think Kiersten just insulted the Republic. That's an outrage.
But the DOD isn't in charge of the Guard in these things, right? This would be a Title 38,
Yeah,
Title
it wouldn't
22.
be the DOD.
It
Like, I
would be
think,
DHS, yeah.
and I think you
That
could
has to be
also
clear.
look at how
Unless
do you
we've had a coup.
How do you mobilize the civilian workforce? So there are ideas about, you know, one of the things we haven't talked about workforce, which is good because I have a lot of thoughts about cyber workforce and how we talk about it in a way that doesn't actually reflect the true issues. But I think that one of the things that CISA has done is bringing in industry executives to essentially sit at CISA while you have your other job. There's no reason why we can't build a reserve of industry executives, industry knowledge, you know, engineers, operational people. We have these technical advisors that they can be part of that. I don't think it's DOD. I think it's where's the expertise to look at this offensively? Where's the expertise to look at this and defend? I'm not insulting the Republic. I think it's something that as a nation we have to invest in, our ability to see ourselves strong and mental strength, and not have our ability to think as something that others see as a tool they can use against us.
So, I mean, I will go back to the first thing that I said, which is I think the FCC absolutely has to regulate, and if there's a challenge to the FCC's authority to do that, Congress needs to step in and say they have to have the authority to do that. I think that's the baseline, right? You have to have strong cybersecurity requirements. To Mark's idea, I always ask the question, well, what is it that the government is actually better at doing than the private sector, right? And the answer usually when you talk to DOD is, we've got the resources and we've got the people and we've got the technology, blah, 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 blah. Well, those are all things that AT&T can hire for and they can pay for, right? People, resources, technology, intel can get shared. We haven't done that. So really the DOD's role here is to make better use of offensive cyber for defensive purposes. And what we're missing is the link between DOD Cyber Command, or hopefully Cyber Force, fully on board with that idea, and the private sector. How do we get into a situation, not in which AT&T is saying to Cyber Command, you know, point your lasers here, and DOD salutes, but when it is international security interest, we are tipping and queuing from the private sector in real time to DOD to go and disrupt offensive cyber operations by our adversaries. I think that's the vision that we need to get to. You could have forward deployed people.
Which we did
as
in
part of that.
2018.
But let me just say, yeah, but.
I mean, we did that in 2018.
Yeah, but that was extremely, this is a much bigger mission, I think. So there's an offensive, which I think is NSA tipping off Cyber Command who to go after, or COCOMs asking Cyber Command, could you take care of problem X or Y? And there's what you're saying, offense in the support of the defense. That's where I think we just don't have the body. I mean, I don't think we'll be able to maintain the active duty recruit, train, and maintain, even with a good cyber force. You still have a Cyber Command, they're the force employers. Maybe it's, but they can certify National Guard CPTs to do that mission. And that's what I'm saying. We could in the Guard, because I think it's a version, in the Guard, it may be a version of a reserve that has those people, but we have a lot of NSA, CIA, and Cyber Command trained people who've gone into the private sector and still want to serve their country. I honestly think there is a way to do this. But we need some consistency. We're a long way off. I mean, I would still roll my eyes at anyone who said, we'll do it next month or next year. But I think if we set this up right, we could maximize our capability and capacity. And by the way, if you had that cyber force, I'd just say the reserves can be people who smoke a little weed, have a face tattoo, grow a beard, and don't fit in a uniform. You're okay. We can still use you. The problem is, in the current system we have, we can't use you, and that's not going to function for us.
I had this discussion with the Chief of Naval Operations in 2010, so I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah.
But, and I do think, we can, in the question and answer period, which will begin in about 5 minutes, there's two parts to this solution. The first part is hardening our own infrastructure and resilience. The second part is dissuading our opponents from feeling like they have an open door. And we've clearly failed at the latter. Yeah.
And we might be trying to do too much of it all in the same way, right? I mean, a deterrence effort has to be so deliberate, but I think also what Rob was saying about what does government do better than industry, I don't know that we actually all agree on what that is, right? I think that we're seeing better intel gathering, collection, and analysis capability on the part of industry. Not better than government, but some pretty strong. So is it cross-sector? Is it interdisciplinary? Is it a dashboard view of what all of this looks like? And we haven't even talked about supply chain from a deterrence perspective.
Well, and I was going to ask, the final question, I'm going to give them three. What did this administration leave on the table? What's on your wish list, the top three that the next administration should do? And we can all think of things we were involved in that started and we're a little too close to the finish line to see delivery on them. What would you pick? Rob, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm only going to give you two. Disruption. We set out a goal. We made pillar 2 of the strategy, disrupting cyber adversary activity on a reliable, continual basis, playing and winning the game of whack-a-mole. We have not built the organizational construct with the private sector for that kind of collaboration to happen. So we've got to do that. Getting back to all the typhoons, we see them continuing to use our own critical infrastructure against us, using the cloud, using home office and small office routers to stage their attacks on U.S. infrastructure. So we've got to be able to disrupt continually that activity, make it so hard for them to operate inside the United States. We really, I think, have failed to do that. The second piece is pushing the ball forward on software liability. We had a little bit of oomph in the direction of saying we've got to do this.
That was mine. Go ahead. Okay. No, go ahead. No, I agree with you. I think that's probably not a fumble, but the biggest, would have been nice to have.
So we said it would be a 10-year project. We're 3 years into that 10-year project. I hope it'll move forward over the next 4.
I would say the software liability was the first thing. You know, again, I said secure by design, by demand, however you look at it, but really, where's the U.S. government power to punish companies, to use these words that we're afraid to use? We say vulnerable software, it's defective software. What are we doing to hold these companies responsible? How are we going to do that? It's not a voluntary piece, but how do we lean in hard on that? I also think, I was in the Senate on 9/11, worked on the legislation to create DHS. I remember the mentality, as we all do. It was about never having another 9/11 again. That's not our mindset anymore. We have to look at a Goldwater Nichols for DHS. I think we understand, when I was asked before I went into this role, do you think CISA should be its own agency? I said, just let CISA be an agency, let it function well, let it do the work. I think what you've heard is a lot of interesting thinking about where we are with the threat and where it needs to go, but we have to look at how this department is configured to protect the nation. And deterrence, we have not made it difficult for the adversaries to come after us. And we've got to really think through what that looks like, not just for the threat of today, but for tomorrow.
Let me hit Rob up real quick, though, before we go to you, which is the idea of making CISA a standalone agency along the lines of USTR or something like that. It's kind of attractive. Where do you come out on that?
I think that you have to look at DHS overall. I think this is how the administration is looking at it out of Project 2025, right? Is DHS the right organization for its central border security mission? If so, does CISA fit into that, or would CISA fit anywhere else? My 2 cents, if you were going to look at a major reorganization, I would pull CISA out, I would pull FEMA out, and CISA would operate like FEMA used to as an independent agency. Now, Mark,
All right, so I'm going to respond to that and then give my 3. First, the Project 2025 discussion at CISA is like an extended temper tantrum and should just be ignored. I mean, putting the Department of Transportation is nonsensical, completely unexecutable, and will never have congressional support. Whether it's an independent agency or not, I think is like a separate hour. Let me give you 3. Strategic, operational, tactical. Strategic one, we failed to prioritize. And this is about systemically important entities. It's saying, what are the most important things? You still can't say out loud what are the 200 or 500 most important things that we demand they secure themselves and with a benefits and burdens package that gets at it. We just haven't been able to do it.
Didn't we do this in the Biden administration? I seem to remember.
You mean
We
Obama?
Obama, yeah. Well, we tried, right? And it became this list where somebody said, well, why isn't my critical infrastructure on there? And that sense, the traits, the sort of the pieces that went into what is critical were really never agreed to in a thoughtful way. And I think this is the challenge right now. Not only what is critical, why are you critical, and what does it mean to be critical?
And what are the benefits and burdens? Like if I establish a higher level of security that's third party assessed by the government because the government values me, what kind of liability protection do I get back? The operational one is joint collaborative environment, the idea of a speed of data transmission instead of a Slack channel between the government and the private sector. We've got to get to that. And then the third, I'll give you a tactical one, is NIST. NIST is a great organization. At the beginning of the Biden administration, its cybersecurity, we assessed that cybersecurity was $150 million tasking with a $100 million budget. And the Biden administration raised it to 120. You'd say that's good, except if you read every executive order and national security memorandum that mentions NIST, which obviously has no money because it's an NSM or an EO, they're now about $180 million cybersecurity tasking with a $120 million budget. They're not doing things. We saw that when the National Vulnerability Database went dark, for a couple months. That was a plaintive wail from a federal agency saying, you're not giving me enough money. I'm not going to provide the one product I know the rest of the world will kick your butt over for me not providing. In other words, not updating NIST 800s. None of us even know it. We're like, what? They didn't update that NIST 800 for 5 years? Who knew? National Vulnerability Database, it caught our eye. So to me, if we don't fix NIST budgeting, and look, Congress deserves a little, I will say all the increases were congressional. I shouldn't give the Biden, underneath the Biden administration, NIST budget went up. It went up because of Jim Langevin, period. And when Langevin left, the budget go-ups went down, right? And so the budget increases went down. So we've got to get NIST properly funded for cybersecurity. And now you've got this AI, maneuvering around it. It's going to suck some of the money off there. They've got AI tasking coming as well. We've got to get that right. NIST is severely underfunded for the missions we give it.
I would also just like to add onto that I think that we have to be deliberate about why we're sending everything to NIST. There is this sense that it's this objective research body that can do all of this. Is that fair to put on that agency? Are there other entities that can do it? It becomes this just delegation of responsibility, of policy making, of resources that doesn't actually have a very thoughtful direction all the time, and NIST is just left holding the bag.
But let's keep the wind in the sails of appropriating them.
So if you're going to do that, then it has to be deliberate resources to say why NIST, why now, what are the resources that get allocated to it?
I have a couple jokes, but I'll skip them in the interest of time. If you have questions, thank you. If you have no jokes from you, Chris, if you have questions, please, now's the time. Hold up your hand. I think we have a microphone. Is that right? If not, I'll tell the jokes. You're out of luck. What? Oh, we have cards? I have to read? Yeah. Thank you. Goodness, there's a lot of them. Oh, was this you?
You. Asking your own questions.
How does the July 19th CrowdStrike incident affect streamlining cyber responsibilities within USG? You planted this.
I did not.
You planted it.
I think Julia did.
All right. It's your question.
Can you repeat the question?
I can't
Oh, it's your
remember.
question.
Well, I
How
want to
does
hear the exact
July
question.
19th CrowdStrike incident affect streamlining cyber responsibilities within the USG?
It's actually not my question, because it wasn't about streamlining. I think the fact that we have not talked more about what happened on July 19th is pretty extraordinary. You had one company, maybe two, arguably two, CrowdStrike, Microsoft, take down global digital infrastructure for a period of time. Debating how long it was is not the debate. The fact that they got us back up and running as a world, that's table stakes for that kind of dependency on that infrastructure. So why were we in that position? What should have been done? I appreciate that Microsoft stepped in, that CrowdStrike did it so quickly. That's fantastic. But again, when you have that responsibility, when global infrastructure is that dependent on you, that's exactly what you would want to have happen. The challenge is we have done no understanding from and I think this goes to how are we offensive cyber, deterring all of this. We've done nothing to really understand what happened and how to make sure that doesn't happen again. And the answer isn't stronger infrastructure within those companies. The answer is a broader diversification of that type of operation.
Did I miss, is the CSRB doing a review of CrowdStrike?
They are.
Okay. So we'll have that, no?
But I think the fact that we are waiting for, I think they'll do a great job. I think I would agree. I think CSRB has really grown into a very thoughtful, investigative entity. But it goes to broader education on a social level and a cultural level of something that could have been so destructive, and arguably in many cases was, and just not really understanding what that is. And I'm happy to, see what CSRB does, but I think, again, we don't have that education, that knowledge, that awareness as a country, and let alone on the global side, because this to me is also something when you talk about regulation harmonization, the international harmonization piece isn't something we've even gotten into. I mean, I certainly hope there's greater investment. I think what Nate Fick has done at the State Department has been really fantastic, and I think there's got to be more on a global engagement level to look at this. It's not a U.S. question to answer about what happened with CrowdStrike and Microsoft. It's a global question.
So maybe that should have been on our list of to-do list, because what the July 19th incident showed me was that you had a new target set, which was the third-party service providers that hit one, cripple zillions. Anyhow, next question. What role should Congress play, if any, in shifting cyber response to NCD and incentivizing it? We kind of talked
You wrote
about
that
that.
one too.
I didn't write that one because look, the law is a pretty good law. It had minimal of all the legislation we tried to pass with the Solarium Commission, most of the significant ones were kneecapped along the way to some degree, systemically important entities, things like that. Even the SRMA.
Who kneecapped them?
Sometimes the administration, sometimes the other congressional committees who are worried. So like a strong part of the Sector Risk Management Agency bill, which was very good for the agencies, but then removed the formal designation of CSIS as the Sector Risk Management leader, was removed by the other congressional committees at the behest of the other federal agencies who don't want anyone in charge of them. I revert back to my rant of 30 minutes ago. So that's that. But the one that got through pretty clean was NCD, because everyone thought the White House would remove it, in the end. Well, the Trump administration did ask us to remove it, and then the incoming Biden transition team asked us to remove it. At that point, it was an already vetoed NDAA, which made any changes impossible, which was brilliant for us, and got it through. And there was no SAP because the president had vetoed. There's no signing statement by the president because there was no, it was a vetoed, it was an overridden veto. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better deal for us. And so the NCD one's actually written pretty strong. It's the implementation of it that matters. There's stuff in there that says the president should do this. The president doesn't, and how he runs his White House, that is the president's choice. If a president were to implement all the elements of the NCD properly, they would get the instrument. And I agree with you that I'm just probably a two-step guy. Get the UCG kind of elements first, get the CRG elements second of cyber. That is, get the more deliberative planning parts first, get the actual execution of an incident response second. It had good budgeting stuff in there, which to the great credit of the OMB director, Ms. Young, and Chris Inglis, we had a compact on that I hope carries over into the next, carries over into the next administration. So I think the NCD's in the right spot, Jim. I think it's got the right manpower. It's a little smaller than USTR, but bigger than anything in the NSC.
Do you agree with that, Rob?
I do agree with it. I think that there are sections of the law that have not been put to use yet. Building out the operational capacity of NCD, the role is clearly there. It's also written in such a way as to protect the prerogatives of individual agencies, not to have their actions directed by the NCD, but to coalesce and bring them together. I think building on that needs to happen. Really, I think this goes back to what Mark said. I'd like to see a kind of review of all cyber policy and an update to it, to including a roles and responsibilities review and a clearer articulation of who's doing what under current authorities, with the NCD clearly spelled out, with CISA clearly spelled out, with a stronger role for NCD and coordinating efforts.
So that's an NSM 22 rewrite that does more than just acknowledge the existence of CISA and NCD, which didn't exist in the predecessor because it predated them. It kind of acknowledges them, gives CISA a little bit of love, gives NCD the minimum love NSC could stomach giving them. It needs to be a little more clear, and then I think you need to rewrite PPD 41 the same way.
We keep coming back to NCD, so if we have time at the end, we'll talk a little bit more about it. But this is a complicated question, but it's a little off what we've talked about, but let me ask it anyhow. How will existing gaps and vulnerabilities in EU cyber policy affect the U.S. approach to cooperation on trade, technology, innovation, especially with EU member states whose cyber policies are currently ineffective? Anyone want to touch that one? No, apparently not.
Is Chris Painter here?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's it.
No, that's okay. We'll take care of it then. The coordination, if you were going to give this administration some credit, it's done more in building out alliances. You've got work with the Japanese, work with the Koreans, work with the EU, work with the Brits, the Australians. So we've done more internationally on cybersecurity. In part, it's simply the time. It's not like one administration does better than the other, but what...
Well, I think, CISA, we did a lot of work with the Five Eyes, and I think that really, and what was great was to see alignment on issues. So the software liability piece was something that, the UK was a tremendous partner in with AI. When you look at what was going on with Australia and incident reporting, there was a lot more collaboration and learning from each other in regard to that than I think had happened previously. And to your point, engagement with the Japanese, with Singapore, there have been a lot of work. Again, that partnership with CISA and the State Department, I think, was very effective in being able to move that forward. It's this appreciation. One of the things that I didn't call out that I think is a real success is also the joint SEAL work, because it really showed that these are agencies that are working with each other to come out with a statement. I think it's impressive too when industry stepped forward to say, hey, this happened to us. We saw that a lot more over the last 4 years, and we can look back to understand why that is, but that's certainly a step to be able to say, we appreciate that if we're sharing what's happened to us, that by talking about it, by bringing it to government, there's more of that. That's obviously ideal. That's obviously a very simple way of looking at it, but we did see several examples where that was the case. And then, when Boeing stepped forward on Lockbit, it really did a lot to help share that information and hopefully, mitigate other impact.
Let me pick up on international, and I don't blame the Biden administration for this because it's a late comer, but legally and policy speaking, that's Taiwan. I think we do a little bit with them, not as much as you would hope. Taiwan, if I'm China, I'm not going to do a cross-strait invasion. Mark Hansen's war games up there, I don't think they're the most dangerous scenario. The most likely scenario is a cyber-enabled economic coercion campaign. And we have not done enough to help them figure out how to protect energy, finance, and communications against that. And there's a big, rich opportunity for the incoming administration. Laws have been passed, the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act, that opens us up cleanly. There's not a Taiwan Relations Act issue. And we passed a specific Taiwan Cyber Resilience Act the year before in 2022 that has been in effect for 2 years now and really hasn't been fully utilized by the non-DOD agencies to be out there. Energy and commerce and DHS and Treasury need to be in Taiwan working with them on improving the cyber resilience, on doing the workarounds. So if I was the incoming Trump administration cyber, Nate Fick, I would really put Taiwan near the top of my list, because if we can't stabilize them, their societal resilience will collapse before we get to any kind of kinetic war.
Maybe we have 1.5 questions left, so I'll try and cram them in since we're already over, but maybe the half question. What do you think of the counter-ransomware initiative on the international side? Do you like it, don't like it? Did you pay attention to it when you were in government?
So I think ransomware is one of these, it's a business model, right? It's something that we're trying to address the symptoms. We've got to get at the cause. This actually goes back to something that Rob said at the beginning, which is we've got to raise the baseline around regulation and around how we're helping businesses. What we didn't see as much in this administration, and it could have just been maybe what I was paying attention to because I was so focused on it before was really helping small businesses. And I think, ransomware is about the weakest link. It's bank robbery, that has become, there's a capital market for it. We in the United States created a market for it. We covered it in insurance. We covered the ability to get intel on it. We're not looking at the true causes of it effectively in a way to help to mitigate it. So globally, we obviously have to look at it. I'm not totally answering your question, but I think it's something that, we've got to be getting at the source. And if we raise the baseline of cybersecurity, it'll mitigate a lot of the ransomware impact.
Rob, do you have anything on that?
I think, to echo something that Mark said, domestically, we are getting towards operational collaboration and moving away from the tired language of partnerships. We still need to do that on the international front with our allies. And so the counter-ransomware initiative hasn't really evolved into sort of an operational collaboration to go and smack down ransomware operators in real time on a continuous basis. And that's where it needs to get to. We've recognized it as a national security threat. Certainly when there are Russian actors that are destabilizing hospitals, that are causing wait times, that are probably killing people, it's a national security issue. So it's been recognized as such, but we're not treating it as such. We're not using all instruments of national power to go after these actors, and we're not doing it with our allies. So I think that is a next step, and there is a platform with the counter-ransomware initiative to do that.
Well, I hope what we've seen is a progression. If you think back to sort of maybe the first Clinton administration, we were here, and now, given all the administrations after that, we're up here. So the trend line is in the right direction. We covered a lot of ground today. If any of you have any final thoughts, now's your time. Otherwise, no. Thank you very much for coming today.